brilliant to see so many people having joined this session. As you can see from the title, this is all about discussing and surfacing some of the resilience lessons we've been capturing and gathering from the voices from the Frontline project over the past years. My name is Albert Nordstrom. I'm the head of knowledge and evidence from the Global Resilience Partnership. This session is co-hosted by ICAD, CDKN, and the GRP. And what we aim to bring today is really an opportunity in a really nice interactive format, a talk show format, to surface multiple perspectives and messages coming from the community voices from the Frontline initiative, focusing on sources of resilience to the COVID-19 pandemic. With me, co-navigating this session is Shireen Manan, who's a senior research officer at ICAD, and Michelle Dutoit, who's a program manager at CDKN. Basically, the run of the show, how we're going to do this now is we're going to have a quick Mentimeter after these slides. We'll give you the codes and the instructions for that. Then we're going to have a quick overview of the Voices from the Frontline project by Shireen, and then Michelle will take over and guide us in this interactive discussion with 6 fantastic participants. Wrapping up, we will have 2 fantastic voices to give us some reflections, both forward-looking, but also on the session itself, by Shanaz Musa, who's the director of CDKN. She's online here with us now, and Professor Harini Najendra from Azim Premji University. So everyone just sit back and hope you enjoy this as much as we are. A few housekeeping rules. As always, try and mute yourself, please, unless you're speaking. Bandwidth can be saved if you switch off videos. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat box. And if there's any technical problems, you can contact Ida, who's got the name Ida_CBA conference. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we're going to go into quick Mentimeter session. So stay tuned. And if you see in the chat as well now, there's information of where you go in, menti.com, and then just type in the code you see up there on your screen, 2498 7306, and just answer the questions very, very quickly. Just to give us some indication of the participant diversity, who you all are, where you're coming from. Excellent. So we'll give you a few minutes to go in, menti.com, and just type in the code. It's really simple, 2498 7306.
How to do this?
Remember the house rules to mute yourself, please. It's in the control panel at the bottom of your Zoom operating system. Great. Okay, then maybe we can go to the next. We can move the survey forward. We really apologize. We really tried to get the sector names to bigger font at the bottom here, but we couldn't do it in Menti. But here's some question capturing the diversity of organizations represented in the audience. Quite a few researchers now jumping up, some private sector, some other sector. Trying to get a bit of an overview of what organizations, what types of sectors are represented in the audience. If you haven't got into the survey, please do so now. I think there's more than 10 of you out there. Okay, Ida, we can jump to the next question if you can do that. Okay, where are you joining from? What part of the world are you joining from? Yes, Bangalore. People from Uganda, South Africa, Bangladesh, highly represented. Okay, great. Excellent. Okay, Ida, I think that's it. That's the 3 questions for now. We're going to have one more Mentimeter question towards the end. But now, Michelle, I'll leave it over to your very capable hands. Thank you very much and enjoy the session, everyone. Oh, I mean, Shireen, sorry. I'm going to leave it over from my incapable hands over to Shireen, who's going to give us the overview of the Voices from the Frontline program. Thanks, Shireen.
Thank you so much, Albert. And hello, everyone. My name is Shireen Mannan, and I am based at Dhaka, Bangladesh. And as Albert said, I work as a senior research officer at ECAT. Maybe I would like to indicate one point. So I was going through the Slack channel and they were saying like the link that has been posted in the Slack channel actually brings people to the Dragon's Den. I don't know why that happened, but I hope that has been sorted now and people will start joining us soon. Give me a moment so that I can share my screen. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So today I'm going to present on a really interesting project, which is called Voices from the Frontline, and it's a joint initiative between ECAT, Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and Global Resilience Partnership. So let me just give you a bit of a background of the project and from where it's actually started. So last year, when around March or April, when the COVID-19 was declared as a global pandemic, everyone, almost all the countries and nations went into lockdown, and everyone was really scared, panicked, and uncertain about what would be the public health impacts of this pandemic. But what these 3 organizations actually thought that beyond health impact, there are also different economic and social impacts, because almost all of us were in lockdown and we couldn't really go to work and all that. So there are really more grave economic and social impacts other than beyond health impacts. And there is also a common notion that when such a crisis strikes, the local communities actually are the most vulnerable. They are always relying on the external services or reliefs to, survive. But we actually argue that that's only one side of the picture. But these local communities are also extremely good at, self-organizing themselves and using the whatever resources they have, whatever connections and networks they have, and actually build resilience and safeguard the most vulnerable within themselves. And we thought that it's also really important to capture these stories of building local resilience when it comes to tackling with an unprecedented crisis like COVID-19. And we felt there's a need to actually capture these stories of local community resilience and disseminate the informations and learnings with different communities and different stakeholders all over the world, so that they can learn from each other and prepare themselves effectively. So on that note, we actually took up this project by we mean ECAT, CBK, and GRP, with an objective to actually accumulate and gather these stories of community resilience building in the face of COVID, and also disseminate the stories so that it enhance community resilience in the face of future crisis. So that's the really simple flyer we actually used for our project. So what are the activities or the components of the project? So essentially, the primary tool to collect or capture data was building stories. And throughout the project, we have actually developed and published total 45 stories coming from different parts of the world, from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Pacific. So initially, our project started at May 2020, and we initially thought that we would be able to, continue this story series and the project for 6 months. But then we actually thought that it's we are getting a lot of stories, and it's important to disseminate and share these stories. So we tried to extend the project for 1 year, so it ran from May last year to May this year. And throughout the project span, we actually published total 45 stories from different parts of the world. Stories were essentially on building resilience, to tackle COVID-19, but a lot of them also captured stories on dealing with other compound risks, such as in Bangladesh, India. In this part of the world, we had cyclones in 2 consecutive years. We had floods together with COVID-19. Then in Africa, there were other climate related disasters, in Latin America, everywhere of the world actually. So it actually helped us to capture stories of resilience building in general, to COVID-19 or to climate crisis as well. And so apart from the collection of stories, we actually also focused on how do we actually disseminate the learnings in different platforms with different type of people. So we actually took different conferences, seminars, webinars, so that we can, we can share the learnings with other stakeholders, and B, we actually also wanted to give floor to these grassroots speakers, because they have been doing a lot of amazing work at the ground, but they don't really get the chance to take the center stage and discuss about their efforts. So last year we had a session at CBA, and now we are having a session here. So CBA is really a practitioners conference where a lot of grassroots people, academics, private sector, donors, and different practitioners come together, and they get to learn and know more about these stuffs. And then we also participated in academic conferences like the Gobishona Global Conference this year. So that was also a really good mix of people coming from different parts of the world, academics, university professors, the researchers, together with the practitioners. So they also get to know like how they can also partner with these grassroots people. And we also wanted to touch base on the policy aspect. So we targeted the Race to Resilience dialogue, which is a high-level dialogue that was convened last year. And we had the high-level champion, Mr. Nigel Topping, joining us. And he was also really intrigued to listen to all these stories. And he actually, promised us to, work together with these communities going forward. These are some really good pictures coming out of the stories. And so what was the story making process? So we actually, first of all, we reached out to different networks who are, affiliated with grassroots, or the LAC stands for the Least Developed Countries University Consortium on climate change. So we reached out to different networks and, solicit stories as much as we could. And the whole idea behind collecting stories was not just treating the local, people or local communities as the passive receivers of this opportunity. Rather, we wanted to have them as partners, partnering with us, and learn throughout the process, and emerge throughout the process. So whenever we receive positive proposal from there, and then we had a briefing call with them. Actually, we got to know each other about their story, what is our mechanism, how we are going to partner with them. And then most importantly, we had a virtual training, a capacity building training for them, where we actually supported them with tools or training, like how they're going to conduct the interviews, how they're going to capture stories, how to take pictures, and if you're going for a video, how you're going to produce a video on the story. So that virtual training actually helped them to flourish and be able to nurture their skills and hone on their skills as well. And then once they received the training, based on the training, they actually prepared, conducted the interviews and came up with written transcripts, in some cases audio clips or video clips. And then we had actually editorial board with people from CDKN and ICAT. So we actually then worked on these transcripts and put it into our own format. And then once we prepared the final version, we have also did a bit of a back and forth with the interviewers or the partners, because we really wanted to capture and put in a limelight their perspectives and how they are dealing with things, not just having a outsider's perspective. So it was really important for us to make sure that they are happy with the final story, and we are rightly putting on their perspectives. And then the published story got published on different platforms. So when we actually publish the stories throughout 1 year, and within this time period we saw that we keep getting same kind of messages, same kinds of challenges highlighted by people. And based on that, we have come up with 6 main key advocacy messages that have come out from the stories. First one is definitely addressing the elephant in the room, which is the development deficit. So if we keep getting the development, keep having the existing development deficits, then it will definitely inevitably compound the challenges for the communities going ahead in cases of future environmental crisis. Second one is the caring for the most vulnerable. We all know that due to the lockdown, women have even been more burdened with the caring jobs, or the care work given by them, which is largely unrecognized and we see as a charitable activity. So that should not be a charitable activity and reliant on foreign entities only. Thirdly is the legitimate grassroots organizations. So we should legitimize these grassroots organizations, their knowledge, their planning and decision-making approaches, so that they can also work on these in a better way to get better prepared for the future crises. Next comes the security of migrants, which was highlighted in many of the stories, particularly from Asia and Africa, that the security of migrants becomes a great concern during this kind of crisis and unprecedented times. Finally, the robust rural-urban food supply. So due to the lockdown in most of the countries, like the rural-urban food supply chain was disrupted, and this time has repeatedly highlighted that a robust rural-urban supply chain are crucial to food security, and we should put extra and special attention to that. And finally, and most importantly, like the women have been in charge of taking care of their families, their communities, and taking resilience and leadership. So despite the fact that they are in a way differently vulnerable to different crises, but we should definitely acknowledge the fact that they have an indomitable spirit to take charge and take leadership. So they should be given and should be brought front and center in terms of decision making and resilience building approaches. In terms of communication, so we have published the stories in 3 of the partners' websites. And apart from that, we had Thomson Reuters joining us with blog series. And here we actually tried to come up with opinion pieces, not just by the experts, so-called experts or academics, but we also co-authored pieces with these grassroots leaders, so that at one hand they can get to express whatever they want about their initiatives, their community, and second, to enhance their capacity about writing about themselves and telling the stories by themselves. In order to widen the disseminations, we have used these different social media platforms. We had our ICAD alumni relations, and definitely through other partner organizations. I think we have quite well disseminated the stories. And as I said, we welcome different stories in different formats, but mostly the stories were in written blogs, but we had a few video blogs and audio clips as well. And I have put the link to the web page here. If you want, you can just check on the stories, and I'm sure it would be a good read for you all. So going forward, we are actually also planned and actually have already published quite a few knowledge products, because we felt that it was also important to not just confine these stories into like informal stories, but also come up with some scientific papers and documents. So we have already published one policy brief, which is will actually be discussed today in the later part of the sessions, and 2 of the main authors are already with us. In fact, Albert and David are with us. We have also prepared 4 quarterly reflection reports, which will be uploaded in ICAD's website soon. And these are basically some very quick synthesis documents coming out of these stories. And we are actually also working on a scientific paper, which would hopefully we are aiming to submit that by this year. And this will be a scientific paper from our end. And finally, ahead of COP26, we are also, CDKN and ECAT is also working on a digital book, which we would like to focus basically on the policy recommendations, which can be helpful ahead of COP26. So these are basically the plans for publication from the project's end. And finally, to end the presentation, I would like to highlight that since we have worked on this project and applied these stories for a year, we thought that this tool is extremely effective to collect data from local level and also disseminate this data to other stakeholders. So we would like to keep working on the stories and keep publishing stories, but maybe not just focusing on COVID-19, but rather we would like to expand our focus and publish more stories on locally led adaptation, resilience, community-based adaptation, or maybe disaster risk reduction in any way. So if you are interested and if you feel that you have stories to share, so please reach out to me. I can share and drop my email address. And we are also trying to, by this project, we have also developed a very good network of grassroots organizations. So we are also planning to link these network with other existing networks like the Resilience Knowledge Coalition at GRP, the Gobishana LLA and Resilience Network. So going forward, we would like to really work on with these assets and, work better with other stakeholders. Thank you, Albert. I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Even though I know a lot about this project, it's always fascinating to hear it in detail like this. It's truly so ambitious in its scope in so many ways. We have a few minutes now, 6 to 7 minutes, for some questions to Shireen based on the presentation you just gave on the Voices from the Frontline project. You can either, send your questions in the chat or just raise your hand and we can give you the word. But let's keep the questions short if we have any, just so we can stick to our time schedule. So I'll give you a few seconds, either if you have any questions in general about the project, on some of the findings, on whatever Shireen said, throw them up on the chat or raise your hand, please. And while people are thinking, Shireen, I have a question. I always have a lot of questions when I hear fascinating talks. But just briefly, sorry, I see that Businge has raised his hand. So Businge, we'll pass the word on to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Godlive Businge from Uganda, Women Climate Centers International. Thank you so much, Shireen, for sharing. I was part of the beneficiary. I wrote a story and I think it went through. I would really like to appreciate that. That's really a good way of putting people's voices out there, because I loved the approach that you used, where you had to coach us, gave us the confidence of writing and getting back to us and editing and making sure something comes out. But for me, it was really interesting because I feel like now because I wrote about this girl, I feel like her voice is heard out there and many people are reading her story and seeing what is happening on ground or what can be done. And I think that is something nice that maybe funders or donors, looking at those stories and getting the feel of what is happening on ground, I think people would really appreciate and maybe fund projects or organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Godliver. I think it was a pleasure partnering with you. And I would like to say you were not just a beneficiary, you were, very active partner in this entire process. And thank you for partnering with us. And we really look forward to, working with you again and again. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other reflections? Doesn't have to be a question. It can just be a reflection on what you've heard before we move into the next segment of the session. I can follow up or just continue with my train of thought, Shireen. This is a broad question, but on reflecting back, what were some of the main challenges in trying to connect these local voices to some of the bigger networks and partnerships that you act as a bridge between? Just any reflections on that, if there was anything specific that you felt was problematic?
So when we actually, hold the sessions, when all the parties came together, are you talking about that challenge to connecting?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So I would say, particularly when we, talk with the policy makers or the decision makers per se, they are actually, they are taken by surprise when we listen to all these stories, amazing stories, like, okay, these community peoples, despite not having, much resources or, much networks and connections, they're doing such amazing jobs. So they actually really get fascinated with the stories, and they actually also promise a lot of things, like, okay, like we are going to partner with them in this regard or that regard. But I feel like there is a lack of continuation with, between the conversations, or, in some cases, despite having the interest, there are lack of scopes in terms of, making this partnership. So I believe like there should be more opportunities for, more projects or more platforms where we could regularly bring these all groups together so that they get a continuity in their conversation, and by the end they can, actually bring up some results, or, come up with a really good partnership building idea. So I think, yeah, there is a lack of platform, I would say, that really facilitates the continuation of conversation. So that's really important.
Okay, thanks, Shirin. Michelle, I think it's time for us to pass the baton on to you. Again, thank you so much, Shirin, for this. And now we're deep diving into the talk show session part. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Albert, and thanks, Shirin. A very warm welcome to all of the participants on our little talk show here, and all of you that are listening. Can I ask those participants, if you do have enough bandwidth, if you could please put your video on, that would be wonderful. Obviously, if you don't have enough bandwidth and you're having issues with internet, then, or you feel uncomfortable, then please, please switch it off, that's fine. So what we've done here is we've brought together a whole range of key actors in the resilience space, from those of you who are experts in resilience building, which are the 3 community leaders that we have from organizations spanning Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for joining us. And we've also brought together some organizations and people that have that facilitate and support resilience building. So we've got an academic, we've got someone from regional government, and we've got someone from a multilateral organization. And why we've brought you all together is that we really want to hear different viewpoints and to understand better what are the challenges from various viewpoints and what are the opportunities. So I'm going to be asking each of the 6 of the participants 1 or 2 questions. And I really encourage you to be very candid in your answer. I think the time has passed for us to sugarcoat things. Let's just be honest and frank. And if we have time at the end of the session, then we can open up some questions for the listeners. I also just have to apologize in advance to our participants that we have to keep each question and answer segment to about 5 or 6 minutes. So I might have to cut you off, which I apologize for, just so everyone has a chance to speak. So I'm going to start off with Ms. Rose Wamalwa. So welcome, Rose. Rose, you're the coordinator for the Women's Climate Center International. And what really struck me about your organization is the word co-create. So in the introduction that I got to your organization, it said that you co-create sustainable solutions. And in one of your stories, I read this wonderful quote from Mama Chezengai, which said the solution is with us and within us, which really, it just said so much to me about what your organization is doing. And what I wanted to ask you is, you've worked with various various communities within Kenya. What, in your opinion, were the most effective responses to the pandemic from these communities?
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth Wamalwa, and I'm from Kenya. Sorry, I'll not put on my video because the network is not good. Otherwise, I'll not be audible enough. So I work with Women's Climate Center International, and we work with grassroots communities. And our theory of change is creating a platform for grassroots communities to be fully involved in issues of climate resilience. Because when you talk about climate change, the people that are most affected are women. And so that quote of co-creation is actually creating a platform for the grassroots woman to really identify, because they're the ones that really feel the challenge, are the ones that face the challenges of climate change and any other, disasters that affect the community. And also they have the solutions. And so focusing back on the COVID-19 response, the fact that these women, of course, in each and every country, the government usually come up with, programs and, projects to respond to the issues that are affecting the community. But these women, they didn't want to wait for the government because they thought the government was taking too long, and their families were being cleared up. Their families were, their children, their husbands, their brothers, their sisters were dying. And so they chose to stand up and raise a voice. And in most of these communities, because of traditional beliefs and practices, there are issues that women cannot spearhead. But when it came to COVID-19, I think the women chose not to look at what the community and what other people think about them, but to start creating awareness, to start challenging some of the practices, the meat, burning parties, practices that will jeopardize their families, practices that will put their families in exposure of the virus. And that is where Mama Chesengei, a Maasai woman from Narok, came out and reached out to her, her groups, women groups in the community. And together they started creating awareness about COVID-19, even though they didn't have more information about it, but they chose to use the little knowledge that they have to create awareness about the virus. And of course, to use the locally available resources like, making of liquid soap and distributing to the community, just to make sure that the community, the entire community, was well prepared to respond to COVID-19. And so as WC, we are creating that platform for the grassroots women, the marginalized women, the women who have not been given an opportunity to share their solutions. And yet women are the caregivers, women are the custodians of indigenous knowledge. It is this indigenous knowledge that has actually helped them to respond to COVID-19. They didn't wait for the government to come with the, projects and all that. They had to stand up and make sure that their community is safe. So what I can say is that women, when women are given that approach, the opportunity, the platform to make decisions, the platform to take part in leadership position in the community, I want to assure you guys and the international community that all these challenges that we are facing will be able to handle them and address them appropriately, and will have an impact on the grounds. So let us give the women a platform, the women the opportunity to exercise the solutions and the knowledge that they have to make sure that their families and their communities are safe. Yeah.
Rose, thank you very much for that. So what I'm hearing from the work that you've done with the communities and your organization has done is that women were given a platform and were given some opportunity, and they took that opportunity. So thank you very, very much. Thanks for your intervention. So we're going to go through now. I'm going to go through to Mr. David Mfitumukiza, who co-authored a brief on looking at using the evidence that was coming out from the Voices of the Frontline series to see what aspects of the social dimension of resilience were being used. And what you found, David, was that in all the cases you looked at least 4 of the 6 social dimensions of resilience were being used. So before I go, I'd like you then go and ask the question, which one of these social dimensions of resilience should be prioritized? But before I ask you, go on to that question, can you very briefly explain to us what social dimensions of resilience are?
Oh, many thanks, Michelle. My name is David Mfitumukiza. I'm from Makerere University, Kampala, Uganda, but also I coordinate the Least Developed Countries Consortium on Climate Change for Africa. And together with the colleagues, building on the question that you talked about, we looked at the voices from the frontline that were presented by Charlene, and trying to see exactly, if you bring together these voices, what are the social dimensions and the indicators of these social dimensions that these communities are drawing on. And when you talk about social dimensions, we are talking about various social elements that are very critical for building and supporting resilience efforts, and these include they include a number of dimensions. One, we are talking about the assets, which enable people mobilize, enable to deal with shocks and stresses. And when we talk about assets, we are talking about financial, technological, and services that people can have access to amidst shocks or stresses. The other one is flexibility. The flexibility, we are talking about a wide range of opportunities for switching between strategies so that they can be able to diversify among the potential options available for them. The other one is on organization. Another social dimension is organization, which looks at ways in which society is organized in ways that can enable or inhibit ability to cooperate or undertake collective action and knowledge sharing. So that's the fourth one. The fifth one is the learning part of social dimension, which is about ability, capacity to generate, absorb, and process new information about response options and ways to live with and manage uncertainty. In this case, we are talking about COVID in the context of the policy brief that we worked on. The other one, you talk about urgency. Urgency is the ability to have free choice, and you talk about freedom and to respond to environmental change. And this mainly is aimed at supporting active decision-making, including power and influence that is involved in decision-making. So broadly speaking, those are the major resilience dimensions we are talking about. The other one is about the social cognitive constructs. Simply put, you're talking about behavior and cognitive factors. You're talking about attitudes towards risk, personal experiences, social norms that enable or constrain resilience among communities. So those are broadly the broad dimensions of social resilience that we are talking about. Now, in terms of the key aspects that we see coming out from the analysis of these voices from the frontline, one major one is the assets. The assets, access to assets, and in this case, the major aspect here, which is very critical to consider, is, for example, if you talk about a rural community and you talk about an urban area which is subject to impoverished in terms of poverty levels, ICTs, for example, access to ICTs, ability to communicate, and you talk about lockdowns, shutdowns, and slowdowns. These such a physical assets are very, very critical, enabling communities to connect both virtually and physically. So the other one, of course, is which is very, very critical and is about social organization. And in this case, we are talking about social capital, how people are able to get together, mobilize themselves, and mobilize the resources within the communities so that they use the networks they have, both within their community and outside the community, so that those different abilities that different individuals, households have can be brought together to support themselves amidst such as shocks and stresses. And this particular case, we're talking about COVID-19. I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, David. So the two that you've drawn out is access to assets and then social organization. And you mentioned the importance of social capital and of networks. Thank you very much for the important research that you and your co-authors did in this, in bringing together these two aspects. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to go over to Mr. Rakesh. Welcome, Mr. Rakesh. You joining us from India, and you the CEO of a not-for-profit organization called Shramik Bharti. I think I said that correctly. And you, part of what your organization has done is been leading a grain bank and also having some food gardens or vegetable gardens. So, and that through this work, you were able to provide food security to a number of communities when the COVID pandemic hit. And what I wanted to ask you, Mr. Rakesh, is how did you collaborate with local government in order to be able to support those communities during the pandemic? Was there any interaction with local government? And how did you collaborate?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this discussion. We are collaborating with the government in their efforts of mitigating the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on communities. So we are supporting them in multiple ways. One, we are helping in creating awareness in communities by two ways. We have a community radio station which creates awareness around this issue, and our volunteers reach out to communities physically and created awareness. So awareness is one of the important activity that we did to reach out and create understanding of the disease. Then the issue was of treatment if somebody is infected. So we helped in reaching out to the communities and providing medicine kits and diagnosis of the primary diagnosis of people who are sick with by simple use of oximeter, thermometers, which were not available in rural communities. So we provided these things to our volunteers, and they identify people who were infected. Then we helped to reach out to families who were in need of ration, of dry food material they were not having because they were not getting jobs during this period because of the lockdown. So we provided dry food material. So we kept on complementing the efforts of the government. Additionally, we are also working on restoring livelihoods by providing small incentives, small support, for example, to start nutrition gardens or to start some small livelihood activities. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Rakesh. So what I find really fascinating is that the platforms that you'd already created, that you are actually supporting local government and complementing the efforts. So it's you know, really showing the value of these kinds of your initiatives and these kinds of community-led interventions. So thank you very much for that, Mr. Rakesh. I'm going to now go over to Sarah Burt, who's my neighbor here in Cape Town. Welcome, Sarah. You, the Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the Western Cape Regional Government, and you work on mainstreaming climate change adaptation within the province, but also within local governments, local governments within the province. So I think you wear a bit of a regional and local government hat. What I'm going to do, I wanted to see if we had time for 2 questions, but I'm going to prioritize just in case and ask you, having heard about the social dimensions of resilience and the research that David and the co-authors did on that policy brief, do you agree that these social dimensions of resilience should be included in policy and planning? And how could one even go about doing that, as a lot of what those dimensions are quite soft or intangible? They're not maybe that concrete. So I hand over to you with that rather difficult question. Sorry, Sarah.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me as part of this. Yeah, there's been some really interesting insights so far from all the different parts of the world. I think just from the perspective of my experience in the Western Cape, so I mean, just in South Africa in general, the poorest 50% of South African citizens were hardest hit by the pandemic in terms of job losses. So, you know, a lot of the discussion is really at that level and how we can support communities at the community level. I think in the Western Cape, in terms of the resilience at like a government level, we were kind of fortunate in that we had recently had a drought. So fortunate, not fortunate, but that actually taught us a lot in terms of resilience at an institutional level, government level, to create connections and to build on like almost like a social network within those spheres, which also linked to communities. And so as soon as the pandemic hit, all of that was kind of reactivated. So our disaster management could immediately link into all the people that they needed to in different departments, different local governments, and even at the community level, so linking to CBOs and NGOs. So that was, I think, quite critical in the Western Cape response, and it's a good learning in terms of climate change into the future as well. What can we learn each time something like this happens so that we're better prepared the next time? But certainly at the social dimensions, we have seen that in terms of assets being one of the important ones that were raised earlier, tapping into sort of networks to create like financial buffers is always really important, and we do have some of those systems in place in South African communities. But I think the big problem with some of those is that they quickly become depleted. So it's helpful in the short term, but when we're looking at long disaster events and disasters like this that are going to have far-reaching consequences, I'm not sure how robust some of those assets are into the long term. I think the technology availability in South Africa, we're quite fortunate. Most people are connected, even the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor in the Western Cape. There's a lot of ICT availability, which has been really critical just for people being connected. I think that's something that we've all been fortunate to experience. And just the ability for social organization, absolutely critical. I mean, when the pandemic hit and we had our hard lockdowns, one of the biggest challenges was food security and food access and the breakdown of food supply systems. And I think that, you know, a lot of that was way beyond anyone's expectation, and communities had to pull together and help each other. And there was some existing networks that were utilized for that, but a lot of new networks were created very quickly, whether it was restaurateurs who suddenly were turning their facilities into kitchens to help others. It was quite phenomenal to see how communities could actually pull together rather than kind of fall apart and disintegrate. So some important learnings from that as well. I think for me, something that I'm thinking about in terms of resilience is what I touched on earlier, is so there may have been some positives in terms of the immediate responses in the first year, but we're seeing massive fallout in terms of the economy and jobs and the resilience, the real resilience in terms of recovering from that or moving into a different state from where we were, I think is still something that everybody's grappling with, you know, within government, different tiers of government, and how do we do that? So that's something that that worries me. And then I think just one last point as well, Michelle, is just the impact on women as well. So a lot of the jobs that were lost and are still being shared are in like tourism, informal sectors, and a lot of those jobs are actually held by women. So we're seeing the fallout in communities and how we can reprioritize maybe our recovery plans to really focus on uplifting women in that process. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. It's for me very interesting how our previous disaster, the drought, actually bore some benefits, and also what you brought up about resilience in the longer term. So that there is some, you know, that we've got to think of the shorter term resilience, but also how it goes forward into the longer term. So thank you very much for that. Angeli, welcome. Hi. So Angeli Barafon, you're the Policy and Partnerships Advisor from RARE, and your organization leads behavior change in conservation. And what really struck me from reading the story around the fishing community in the Philippines is the fact that these communities are facing multiple stresses and complex crises. So, and I know this happened in Kenya as well. There was the COVID pandemic in Kenya on top of a flood. And in the fishing community that was written about, there was the COVID pandemic and then a typhoon, which hit an already economically badly hit community. And I wanted to ask you, also leading on from what Sarah's just talked about, how important have you found that the building and maintaining of social networks has been to enable communities that you work with to survive during these times when multiple stresses are hitting them?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that question. And good afternoon, good morning, and to everyone around the world. As Michelle said, I worked for an NGO called RARE. It's a conservation NGO working for sustainable fisheries in the Philippines. And you're right, Michelle, in highlighting that also aside from the pandemic that hit us last year, the Philippines has always been bound to have these different disasters in our country. So we should have been like prepared in terms of attitude and behavior in receiving this kind of disaster, but really no one was prepared when the pandemic hit last year. But as you said, the value of having building that strong relationship with networks really played a great role, especially with the enforcement of the lockdown and the restrictions, because among the mitigation and adaptation solutions that we immediately take into effect right after the restrictions and the lockdown is to make sure that the communication that we have with our partners, whether that be from the national government, from the code delivery partners, and most importantly, our partners from the sites will not be hampered. So that's one thing that we made sure. So internally, immediately, we had an adaptive planning strategy within the organization to make sure that among the things that should not be cut is the communication between them. So following that communication, we immediately hired additional people from the local sites that we have to make sure that there's an additional level of people, making them feel that we are not there, but these people will continue to be there for you and bridge all those gaps or challenges that we will be facing. And then after that, we conducted immediate surveys on the challenges that they were facing. So this is part of the mitigation things that we made sure that will be addressed first. And then we made sure that all those challenges will be addressed based on the national government solutions that were implemented. So based on the relationship that we established with the national government agencies, we made sure that those ordinances and resolutions that they released will really reach out to the local government units that we have. And then after that, we conducted also what we call kumustahan sessions. This is basically check-in sessions with our mayors to check how they are, what are the challenges, how can we help, how can our co-delivery partners help also with the challenges that they're facing. And then this is towards building already the long-term priorities and the planning, which is aligned basically to the national government recovery and resilience plan. So basically focusing on health systems, food security, government connectivity, and addressing the migration from one province to another province. So essentially the core of everything is really the network, building that network and making sure that despite the long distance relationship, you make sure that you don't cut that communication with them and make them feel that you're there to help them always.
Thank you so much for that, Anjali. And just, it's really interesting for me that raising the point of communication and how you can still have effective communication, even if you're not able to be physically together. And the fact that you stressed that communication, had check-ins with the mayors, helped people to feel supported. So I assume to feel like they can do things and that they are not vulnerable. You know, even though they're vulnerable, they have got agency. And what also struck me is the links and the collaboration that you had with national government. So working together with government and not in opposition with government.
Definitely, it's very important to work with them because the people will the people will definitely ask us what the government is trying to do in terms of addressing the problems that they have. So we have to bridge that between the government and the people as well.
Thanks very, very much. So now we're going to go on to our last speaker, Ms. Dilruba Haider. Hi, Dilruba. And Dilruba is currently the program specialist on disaster risk reduction and climate change and humanitarian actions at the UN Women Bangladesh Country Office. But Dilruba, I've seen that you've also worked for various local in Bangladesh nonprofit organizations. So your work spans the shaping of policy, but you've also been very in touch with the realities of communities on the ground in disaster-prone areas. So you've got, I think, 2 hats or a range of hats that you wear. And I wanted to just ask you what your response is in terms of your experience to what Anjali has just said, in terms of how local government, regional, national government, and NGOs can all work together, and also what your reflections are on what she's just said.
Thank you very much. Michelle, I think she has really rightly pointed out the not only how they work, but actually it's extremely important to enhance the resilience of the community. The community, the at-risk communities, they really need to have the communication and the connections with the service providers. So that means if I talk about the Bangladesh context, we have a very detailed disaster management architecture in place, disaster management committees at different levels, starting from the national level down to the grassroots level. And so in these disaster management committees, there are all these elected people, and some are selected members. But the people at risk, they need to have access to these disaster management committees to then say to them their needs, their requirements. And also there are other institutions in Bangladesh, like in the coastal belt, we have this huge cyclone preparedness program, which includes like more than 70,000 volunteers in the coastal belt of the country. So the at-risk women and girls and the most vulnerable peoples linkage and communication with the CPP volunteers, that's also critical. And of course, not to mention the government officials at the local level, and therefore the access of the most vulnerable people, including women and girls, to these local government officials. So that's absolutely important. Just to give you an example, that in UN Women Bangladesh Country Office, we have been working in a program which is called National Resilience Program. And under this program, we have been developing precisely this. We have been developing capacity of something like 56 women CSOs. And specifically women CSOs, because we feel that, you know, women, I mean, they are the agencies, they are the voices of the women. So all these 56 women CSOs. Then we have the disaster management committees, and especially there are women members in disaster management committees. So trying to develop their leadership capacity. And then we have the cyclone preparedness program. We have journalists at the local level. So trying to develop some sort of a network. First of all, developing their capacity, and then capacity with regards to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And then, and on top of that, the gender aspects of it. I mean, why looking at the gender, I mean, looking at the whole thing from gender lens. And then try to develop a network amongst all these stakeholders to make sure that when the disaster comes, when there is an early warning, all these groups can talk to each other and support each other. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to flag here is what my first colleague from Kenya was talking about, the women's issues. I mean, we all understand that, you know, women and girls are the most vulnerable in any disaster. And unfortunately, women's issues are seldom recognized. Everything is seen as a straitjacket. It's never straitjacket, because the risks and vulnerabilities are very different for men and women. Men and women, women, for instance, women and girls, for instance, have protection issues. safety and security issues, the GBV aspects to look out for. But, and especially in disaster, these things actually get out of hand many a time. So when we plan any response program or DRR program or adaptation program, we really need to think about specific needs of men and women, and therefore design. So gender analysis is really, really important. But unfortunately, throughout the world, the capacity is not that great. I mean, at least not at that level. I can talk about Bangladesh. The capacity isn't there as much as we would like to have. Last year, we did a COVID, rapid gender analysis on COVID impact, and we realized the lack of adequate capacity in that. And so, as a result of that, this year we are trying to develop capacity, giving training to the humanitarian practitioners on rapid gender analysis. But that's very important. I mean, having the capacity to do the proper gender analysis. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dilruba, and thank you for really highlighting the importance of linkages. I think that's come through in a lot of what the speakers have said today. And then also what struck me is that there's a building of leadership that's happening within the work that you're doing, building women leaders to be able and capacitating them. So thank you very much. And also for raising the importance of building capacity and improving gender analysis and the need for that. So thank you very much. And I just want to say a very warm and heartfelt thank you to all of you who've contributed. It's been really enriching for me to hear from all of you. I want to ask Albert, do we have time? I see that there have been some hands and there have been some questions. Do we have time for 1 or 2 questions, please?
Absolutely, Michelle. I think we have time. We started a bit late, so we can push the session by 5 minutes and end it 5 minutes later. Yeah.
Okay. Would you please, Albert, because I haven't been following the questions, would you please look at the questions and pose them to the people?
Absolutely. We have a question by Ineza Grace. What is the hope that young people can use, especially in vulnerable communities? And how can we ensure that women's voices are heard and listened to, and that the young people are actually paving the way by avoiding business as usual? So maybe some reflections by the panelists on the signs they're seeing about women's groups and their role they're playing and the youth movements in those responses. And Michelle, I'll let you facilitate the questions to the participants, to the panelists.
Okay, I think that sounds like a question for Dilruba. Dilruba, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think I tried to very briefly say that, developing the capacity of women agencies, that's extremely important to create the spaces for women in DRR and climate change adaptation. It's extremely important that the ministries of women and children affairs in Bangladesh, and there are other ministries on other names who are working for women's causes, and also women's CSOs. And there are various women's associations. They need to come forward and develop their capacity in addressing and getting engaged into DRR and climate change adaptation actions, and raise and create that space for the grassroots women to then, these women's agencies providing that or creating the facility for the grassroots women to come forward and raise their voices at national, international, regional platforms, because that actually make the greatest impact. And as Shahrin was saying about the stories, of course, we need data, and that's something that's very close to my heart about these disaggregated data, and we do work on that, and various partners are working on that. That's extremely important, especially if we when we work on the policy arena. But stories are really, really powerful, and if the story is coming from the mouth of the people who are living the crisis, nothing stronger than that, and that platform has to be created and facilitated. Thank you.
And I thanks so much, Dilruba. I also wanted to ask Rose, do you have anything to add because of the work that you've been doing within Kenya, especially with women's groups?
Yeah, I think as my colleague has mentioned, it's actually very important to focus on approaches that are gender intentional, that will identify and address issues and of course gender gaps that we are experiencing on the ground, especially the marginalized groups, of course the women and the youth, so that they have access to decision making, access to available resources, and also approaches that are gender transformative, you know, making sure that they more resources channeled down to such groups to invest in the local initiatives that the youth and women are moving on the ground. And I think it's also important that we strengthen the voice of the youth, the voice of the women, and expand their choices. You know, by that I mean that they need to have control over their lives, over their futures, that whatever solutions they have need to be heard and they need to be supported in this way. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Rose. Over to you for the next question, Albert.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we have time perhaps for one more question. There's a lot of them coming up, so sorry again, apologies for not being able to get all of them. But there was an early question here by Nikki Batangai on the importance of getting information on COVID-19, information flowing out to the community early on. So any reflections on that point by some of the panelists? Michelle, I'll let you kind of shuttle that question out, but the early flow of information on COVID-19 and the importance of that.
I think it would be useful to hear from Mr. Rakesh and also from Anjali on that. Mr. Rakesh, do you want to start? Is this a question that you think is valid for the work that you've done?
Yes. In our case, our community radio station worked for providing information to the communities, and communities which are remote, which are rural, and where the right kind of information doesn't reach. So there are a lot of myths about the pandemic, about the virus, about the treatment. So we played that role of working with the government to provide right kind of information. Another thing that we could do is during the pandemic, we formed a social media platform to provide right kind of information for the treatment, especially for different facilities that people were seeking. So that is, yeah.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rakesh. And Anjali, do you have anything to add, given the focus on communication that your organization had?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Similar to Rakesh, we also used the local radio process, and at the same time understanding which effective communication channels that each LGUs use. So it doesn't necessarily mean that radio may be good for everything. So we try to understand first which ones or which channels are more effective in each of the sites. So, and making sure that we use these channels.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I also just quickly, before I hand over to Albert, want to say that Sarah Birch from the Western Cape Regional Government has put some information about a gender analysis that they did. So if anyone is interested in that, please let us know. I see there have been a few people that have responded, and then we can forward it on. Albert, I see there are some more hands, but I don't know if we've got enough time. I'll leave it to you as the time person.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I get the evil task of having to cut off these really interesting discussions, and I really apologize, but this is to give everyone the chance to kind of wrap up and go to other sessions. We're going to run a bit later in any case. We're going to run 5 minutes late, but I really want to give the chance to fantastic people who we've invited in to give some kind of overarching reflections on the topics at hand. If you have questions, you can always email them to us, and we'll try and get them out to the participants in some way or another. And you haven't had the questions answered in any way. But I'd like to start off first with Professor Harini Najendra. Who's here with us. She's from Azim Premji University, just to give some quick reflections. And thank you very much for taking the time to come here. Just some quick reflections on the previous discussion, especially in the context of how all of this connects to your own work on social capital, resilience, and collaboration on local levels. So please go ahead, Harini.
Thank you so much, Albert. A big thank you to all the participants, because it's been very interesting to listen to all this work as I'm reflecting on India, which is just going, I think, getting over the hump of the worst of the second wave of COVID. We're also very aware at this time, I think, that COVID is only one of probably several future planetary shocks of various kinds that we have to brace ourselves for, unfortunately, in this century. We have climate change, we're going to have biodiversity collapses, and what I think COVID tells us is that these are planetary shocks, but their effects will be strongly local. And it also tells us the limitations of our capacity to forecast. We thought we would know, but what we're realizing is these are such complex issues that, as with any complex system, there's the factor of unknowability. It's not just that we don't know enough, but maybe some of this cannot be known in advance. So we will have to take all of our decisions in this landscape where we really are trying our best to predict what comes, but we don't know. And so any planning in an atmosphere of unknowability must be adaptive, and I think people have talked about that a lot. It must be polycentric, so we must have multiple levels from the national and international all the way down to local, with connectivities across different levels. And it must be very really adaptive on the fly, and I think people have talked about that a lot. So how do you have a system or a plan of action for, let's say, the next 1 week, 6 months, 1 year, but make sure that that plan of action can be really modified on the fly? And that means things like funding being modified on the fly. That means things like networks being put together in a week's time. And ICT, as I think people have pointed out, I was very struck by that. ICT can be extremely powerful. ICT can also be very polarizing, because it depends on who has the money and the capacity to really use these ICTs. And I think some of the discussions I found from the India, the Philippines, the examples in Cape Town, is that ICT has been used effectively, but with a very keen ear out to the possibilities of exacerbating inequity. Right? So how do you use it? It can be a very effective tool, and I think we need to understand how to use technology very well without exacerbating inequities in power. So that's one thing that has come through, I think, very as subtext. I haven't seen that emphasized, but it's come through very strongly. Something that, of course, came through very strongly is gender, and women, as multiple presenters pointed out, not just face the worst of the challenges of climate change, they also have the challenges, or maybe are forced to have the challenges, because they have houses to run, children to raise, and really they have it's do or perish, really. And that, since that burden is on them, we often laud them for their creativity, and we should, but I think we also should recognize that the toll it takes on them to have to pull rabbits out of hats at every opportunity, right? So gender seems to be a really important focus, but all of this is hugely taking a toll, of course, on women's mental health, and will affect their capacity to deal with future stresses. And as we know, again, with climate shocks of various kinds, we are going to face these future stresses. So not just to write about them and celebrate them as must, but how can we help them heal and get ready to deal with future conflicts? I think this is something we really must be thinking about very, very clearly. For instance, there's clear work, especially from India, but also many parts of the world now, that vaccinations are so gender biased and they're leaving women completely behind. And there are many reasons for that, but we need to look at those kinds of things as we move ahead from COVID recovery. How is it that the same, we say women are most responsible for leading the recovery, but then we're not getting women vaccinated? And when if a woman is gone, what happens to the rest of the family she leaves behind? The elders, the children, everyone who's dependent on her. Right? So that is another thing that I think we need to be focusing on. Two more things that I think came out very strongly is the memory of networks. And this is something, again, if you're looking at future pointing to, I wanted to point to that, because for these future shocks, it seems very likely that we will draw on the networks that we've created. And again, both in the Philippines and the work from Cape Town, I think pointed to that existing networks came together very quickly to respond to COVID challenges. How do we then make sure that the memory of these networks is alive? And again, from a lot of work I've known personally in India, the first wave, when people came together with networks, they were almost completely disbanded because nobody thought a second wave was coming. But it was so easy to put the networks together for the second wave because trust comes. Yeah? So it's not just the physical network or the ICT of the network, but it's the trust of the network. It's the people-to-people connections. It's all that intangible. So how can we make sure that that memory is alive and that we allow or facilitate people to build on that, to strengthen themselves and to heal as well as prepare for future challenges. So I think that's something that we need to do. Maybe ICT can be better used for things like that. Something we need to figure out. There, I think languages become very important because ICTs, when they're all about English, then it's not going to work in terms of keeping local conversations alive. And if it's all about the internet, they have to move to things like phones or community radios or different ways of doing that. So that's again something I think we need to push a lot more on and learn more. And finally, I think that's just the last, because I know we're really running close to the time. I think the unanswered elephants in the room are equity, power, and justice. And we've been sort of skirting, I know in the beginning there was somebody said we should look at uncomfortable issues also and stare them in the face. And of course, power, equity, justice have played themselves out heavily in shaping a lot of these responses. And again, while we celebrate these successes, we must recognize that there are these systemic forces and we need to figure out how to dismantle them. Otherwise, we're really not going to go ahead. So with that, I'll wrap up.
Thank you very much, Hadini, for those very wise words and insightful thoughts and reflections on what's been said today. We have a final person now who's going to reflect on the session. I'm delighted to bring up Shanaz Musa, who's the director of CDKN. I'd just like to tap into your thoughts, Shanaz, with a focus on how the type of knowledge and insights that have been discussed today can actually be then harnessed to support future climate resilient development, or kind of broad resilient development. And just before you go ahead, Shanaz, please, all the participants, stay and listen till the end. We're going to run a bit over time. And there's also going to be a final Mentimeter question after Shanaz has given her reflections. But please, Shanaz, go ahead.
Thank you, Albert. So I'm feeling quite intimidated after Harani presented, because I'm thinking, what is there left to say? So brilliantly said, Harani. Thank you. For me, what came across, there's three things that really stand out. And I'm just looking at my notes because I took notes. It's not as much about the what was done, but it was about the who. So who are these communities that carried out the activities? Because my sense is that these are the same communities and groupings that will, in a climate crisis, respond. So my sense is there's quite a bit for us to unpack, and as CDKN to actually look at this work and look at the who are these groupings and how will they respond if there's a climate crisis. The next thing that's very, very apparent is there was always agency. So the actions were local, but these communities have had agency, and most of the time they were the women in these communities. And there was use of language around being given an opportunity and so on. But my sense is they were never given an opportunity. They had agency and they responded. So it was never about waiting for an opportunity to respond. And I think thirdly, what we see is that there was an emergency, which was the COVID pandemic. There was a response. And after that response, then there's this moving into a broader resilience. And I think the exact same will happen with the climate crisis. There'll be a response, or likelihood it will be exactly the same respondents that responded to the COVID crisis. And then there'll be the building of resilience. And along that pathway, there is the opportunity for local and national government to be actively engaging to build the resilience, so that when the climate crisis becomes really, really imminent, there is a level of resilience and buffering in place. And I think it's with that I will end off. And just to remind us that actually these stories are really positive. So the responses, and they really should be celebrated and shared and fed up into national government and even into the global climate negotiation spaces around how these communities responded and what lessons there are for the climate crisis. So thank you, Albert, for giving me the opportunity to reflect on the very deep conversation that happened during the session.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. And I like the point you make at the end. I really think we should be seeing these stories as small seeds of a better future that we can try and unpack and understand and learn very, very profoundly important lessons from. We're almost at the end of the session. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Shireen, you have your hand raised. I'll give you the word then. And then just to kind of remind everyone again, to stick around for the final Mentimeter question. And before I drop it over to you, Sharon, I'd just like to thank again all the panelists for joining us, to Shanaz, to Harini, and all the people behind the stages with the technical work to get this session up and running. Thanks. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Albert, Michelle, all the speakers, panelists, and particularly the participants for such active participation. I just wanted to flag on a new opportunity there. So from this CBA15, GRP, Climate Justice Resilience Fund, CJRF and ECADS are actually launching a new sort of a program, which we are calling the Catalytic Grants. So we will be providing grants to top 3 groups, which is worth of 5,000 USD to really work on, develop new networks and work on locally led adaptation and resilience. So my colleague Emma has put all the links in the chat box if you are interested. So please, I will request you all to go visit the links. And we also have a dedicated Slack channel which is called #Catalytic Grant. So if you want, so you can really have a look at it and apply. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. And now maybe over to you, Ida, if you want to share the screen and we can get the final Mentimeter question up, and then people can slowly ease themselves out of the session once they've answered the question. Thanks again, everyone. It was great seeing everyone and seeing such a great engagement with this session.